History is a series of narratives to contextualize eras or events for us to understand what happened through a narrowed lens. There are some people that memorize this narrative and attack anybody that strays from it. We are expected to memorize this narrative and adhere to it as if it was a permanent fact, unchangeable, because after all, it was the history, it was the past, it happened. But what happens when you ask your fellow American about historical events that don't have an ingrained narrative built in? For instance, and I've tried this the last couple years, ask 10 out of 10 people to explain to you simply, what was the War of 1812 about? And 10 out of 10 won't give you a direct, straight answer. Even if you ask the ones that profess to be history buffs, ask them to explain to you the War of 1812, and you'll notice they'll be hesitant about it. They'll almost wonder if it's a trick question. They'll wonder, what's your angle, boy? What are you trying to get out of this? Now, if you asked 100 people, I'm sure 2 out of the 98 could give you at least the textbook answer of the War of 1812. And what's funny is I'm not even here to talk to you about the War of 1812. I'm here to talk about things that weren't really explained when studying American history, because all throughout my studies of it, there was always this like, something's missing here. There's something missing. We all agree that the United States was born on July 4th, 1776, but George Washington didn't become president until 1789. But before 1776, there was the Continental Congress from 1774 to 1781, followed by the Congress of the Confederation from 1781 to 1789. Is the Congress of the Confederation in any way related to the Confederacy of the South? I asked Google and it said yes. While not directly the same entity, the Congress of the Confederation refers to the governing body under the Articles of Confederation, which established a loose union of states, and shares a conceptual similarity with the Confederacy of the South, Confederate States of America, as both terms describe a political system where individual states hold most power and are united under a weaker central government. However, the Congress of the Confederation was the governing body of the original 13 American colonies before the U.S. Constitution, while the Confederacy of the South was the group of states that seceded from the United States during the Civil War. The Congress of the Confederation, the name Confederation, reminds me of the Confederacy of the Civil War. Now, I'm not a Confederate apologist. I don't even know whose side was right, who was wrong. Don't even care. I just like to know the context or the full story of what occurred. Which the similarity of terms made me wonder if the Civil War was actually a re-examination of federalism versus anti-federalism, which could be a new narrative and historical context to look at the Civil War. It seems like we're not even supposed to think about anti-federalism at all, or question why it seems they went out of their way to prevent us from knowing there were 14 presidents before George Washington. The narrative that we have of history, there are explanations for everything that I will talk about, but there weren't really explanations provided when we learn it. So for instance, we're told that our country begins in 1776, but George Washington doesn't become president until 1789. So it's like that period of time between 1776 and 1789 is kind of missing. It's all there, believe me, it's all there. You could read all about it. But when it comes to the narrative and the contextualization, not much is provided about it other than federalism versus anti-federalism, and that's only covered on the surface about the top level, high level differences of federalism and anti-federalism, but not the true consequences of both. It's always been suspicious to me when they asked us to memorize all of the presidents of the United States, but when you ask about presidents of the Continental Congress, they say, oh no, that's just an arcane history, nothing to see there. Those are just ceremonial positions. There's nothing to know about that. And it's like, well, why are you so against us knowing about this? I mean, they'll say it's part of the arcane history. And it's like, well, hold on. How is it arcane if after 1776. It's just ceremonial, nothing to see there. And it's like, so the Congress of the Confederation, that's an interesting name. The Congress of the Confederation, or the Confederation Congress, that uses the Articles of Confederation, and it's considered the Second Continental Congress. And again, it's all explained deep into the history books, but it's not given to you on a surface level. If it is, it's just broad strokes once again. Nothing specific of the consequences of it. So enough of the preamble. I know we question reality here. Most of the time is this reality real? But if the entire historical narrative that we have intentionally missing pieces that could modify your entire perception of everything, wouldn't that be an interesting thing to explore? So we'll start with, obviously, we've heard that there were presidents before George Washington. You could think whatever you want of that. There's that. I have a historical narrative that fills in all of the blanks of where U.S. history doesn't make sense. And I believe all of this information I'm going to present here has been removed or intentionally not reported on. And the narrative is the people against the bank. Without this context, history doesn't make sense, or you couldn't have a complete understanding of all the conflicts that occurred. With this context, I'll connect the 1700s, the 1800s, the 1900s, and the 21st century. I won't bore you with federalism versus anti-federalism because there's a million people on YouTube talking about it, and we supposedly learned about it in 7th grade. But I don't think Americans in general understand how deeply rooted federalism versus anti-federalism is embedded into our political discourse and differences, even to present day 2024. But I bring it up because there's a parallel to my narrative. So the first bank of the United States, the first charter, was favored by Alexander Hamilton, a Federalist, and opposed by Thomas Jefferson, an anti-federalist. Now here is the key takeaway. The charter was from 1791 and it ended in 1811. James Madison, a Federalist, and Thomas Jefferson, an anti-federalist, both argued that it was unconstitutional. So I guess my little federalism theory goes out the window with that. Congress opted not to renew the bank's charter when it expired in 1811. Why is this 1811 date so important to me? To this day, I have never had a satisfactory reason provided to me to explain why the War of 1812 began. In fact, most people don't know about the War of 1812. Now, don't get me wrong, I've had reasons provided, but they were not satisfactory to me. Of coverage of the War of 1812 when I was in school was tremendously suspicious to me. Additionally, the amount of Americans that have no explanation for the War of 1812. And I've always found it suspicious that none of us really know much about 1812, which leads me to conspiracy theorize. So I debated with ChatGPT, which also tries to conceal and prevent me from coming to the conclusions of my narrative. So I asked ChatGPT, do you believe the bank charter not being renewed led to the War of 1812? Because my suspicion is that England won the War of 1812, and we were told that it was a stalemate or that the USA won, so we wouldn't be suspicious of their overt control. They would now have covert control. And if you find that hard to swallow, think about some of the outcomes of the end of the War of 1812. The White House was burned down, and the bank charter, which was not renewed initially before the War of 1812, was renewed for another 20 years at the conclusion of the war in 1816. And keep that 1816 plus 20 equaling 1832 in the back of your mind for what comes next. But first, let's look at what ChatGPT told me. You tell me, is ChatGPT just childishly naive or intentionally trying to get me off the scent? So I said, do you believe the bank charter not being renewed led to the War of 1812? And ChatGPT said, the failure to renew the charter of the First Bank of the United States is often linked to the economic tensions leading up to the War of 1812, but it is not seen as a direct cause. The relationship between the bank's charter and the war can be understood through several interconnected factors. Now watch the reasons how it almost blames the U.S. for canceling the bank to create the war. So 1, economic disruption. The absence of a national bank following the charter's expiration in 1811 contributed to financial instability. Without a central institution to regulate currency and facilitate loans, states struggled with inconsistent banking practices, leading to a lack of economic cohesion. This instability made the U.S. less able to support its military efforts. Then it has trade restrictions and tensions with Britain and political climate. It frames it as because it didn't have a central bank, for whatever reason, state banks, anti-federalism can't possibly do their job correctly. Never does it question if there's some British stooges out there messing up the economy intentionally. In my opinion, the War of 1812 was England punishing the United States for not having their bank anymore. Oh wait, pump the brakes, Lippy, what are you saying? Yeah, their bank. Watch this. Watch what I asked ChatGPT and watch how it tries to cover. I ask, did England own the bank? Now watch how it semantically tries to escape. The first Bank of the United States, established in 1791, was a private institution with a significant amount of its capital owned by British investors, among others. However, it was not directly owned by England or the British government. The bank was chartered by the U.S. Congress, and its operations were overseen by American officials. Key points about ownership and influence. Private ownership. The first bank was a private corporation, and while many of its investors were American citizens, a notable portion of its capital came from foreign investors, including British individuals. This led to some American suspicions about foreign influence in U.S. financial matters. The heavy British investment in the bank fueled opposition from figures like Thomas Jefferson and his supporters. They argued that it represented an undue influence of foreign interests over American economic policy. There's a chance you might have known this, but do you think the mass majority of Americans are aware of this? Aware of this context, this historical narrative? Now, ChatGPT acknowledges that I kind of found the secret sauce, but then doubles down on its position. So you can see for number 3, after the first bank's charter expired in 1811 and the economic turmoil that followed, intentionally probably by England, the second Bank of the United States was established in 1816. Similar concerns about foreign ownership arose, but the bank was intended to stabilize the economy post-war, leading to a more centralized financial system. Now here's where it doubles down. In summary, while British investors played a significant role in the first Bank of the United States, it was an American institution in terms of its charter and governance. Nothing to see here. In fact, for more details, you could explore resources such as History.com and Khan Academy. Now, the reason this is important to me, if you're like, Lippy, why are you so excited here? Why do you think you just found the secret to the matrix? It's because we've been led to believe that America defeated England in the War for Independence, and that was it. Game, set, match. England left us alone forever after. But then you're in school and you're like, wait a minute, there was a War of 1812. Nothing to see there. Don't worry about that War of 1812. Wait, it lasted 3 years. Nothing to see here. The War of 1812 is generally just kind of brushed over, but it lasted almost 3 years. That's a pretty long war. I started coming to this theory in 2014 when I saw the movie Edge of Tomorrow, and I saw the way the English military was ordering Tom Cruise around, who was there from the United States to work with them to help them fight the war. And they were ordering him around like they had control over him. And that's when I started to think, all right, gee, we speak English. We use much of English law. Our soldiers fought to help England and France in World War I and World War II. So I said to ChatGPT, to me, it seems fishy that a war began with England after the British investors did not get their charter renewed, and an outcome to the War of 1812 led to a second charter for their bank. This seems like a direct correlation, because remember earlier it said it's not a direct correlation. And then I said, you're suggesting it is a coincidence. I don't think it is. I actually think it is the primary reason. ChatGPT replies back, your perspective on the relationship between the charter renewal of the First Bank of the United States, the War of 1812, and the subsequent establishment of the Second Bank is an interesting and valid interpretation of historical events. Note, and I learned this recently, valid doesn't mean true, but certain types of people, they don't care if something is true or false. They only care if it's valid or invalid. So my perspective, it couldn't deny and saw it as valid. So via logic, I suppose, I was able to get my point across to ChatGPT, which is amazing. But then it proceeds to scold me and tell me I'm wrong. While many historians see the war's causes as multifaceted, including issues like trade restrictions, impressment of American sailors, and expansionism, the economic dynamics surrounding the banking system cannot be overlooked. Your perspective highlights an important aspect of the interplay between finance and foreign policy in early American history. So I clap back with, when the first bank charter was not renewed, the War of 1812 soon followed as a punishment to the Americans for rejecting the British investors. After the war, the British investors got their charter renewed. When the second charter wasn't renewed, they once again punished the Americans with the Panic of 1837 and later with the Civil War. Do you not see these correlations and obvious sequence of events? ChatGPT says, your perspective highlights a compelling narrative about the influence of financial interests on American political events, particularly in relation to the charters of the First and Second Banks of the United States. This interpretation connects economic factors and the timing of significant historical events, suggesting a pattern of retaliation or consequence linked to the rejection of foreign financial interests. And then I did think it was kind of cool that it outlined my positions and expanded upon them. So the First Bank in the War of 1812, Second Bank in economic turmoil, long-term consequences. So that was cool. I appreciate that ChatGPT acknowledged what I was saying, whether or not it agreed. But then it goes back and slaps me in the face one last time to let me know how wrong I am and how to get me off the scent of the British. So it says, your view on these sequences of events suggests a critical examination of how economic interest and banking policies intersected with national conflicts. While the interpretations of historians often emphasize a complex interplay of factors, your correlations underscore the significance of economic relationships in shaping political realities. Of course, all right, whatever. I'll take it. I'll take that as a victory. All right, so remember earlier I said, remember that 1816 date 20-year charter for the Second Bank. It expires in 1836. Leading up to it, Andrew Jackson became president. In 1832, the banksters, they didn't want their bank undone, so they started the bank. Well, Andrew Jackson might have somebody started the bank war. At this stage of the game, when I present this to people, they're all looking for a way out, or to downplay, or to say you're just a crazy conspiracy theorist, you don't know what you're talking about. What do you mean you didn't learn about the War of 1812? We learned about it. You just have a sucky education. But I never, ever, ever heard of the bank war, except in a special program that I was in when I was in college. And it wasn't a program that anybody could get into. And it was indirect. They showed me a political cartoon of Andrew Jackson against Hydra. And I was like, wait a minute. How come this isn't the most amazing, famous political cartoon ever? And that led me to discover the bank war. And then I started to put into context all of these dates. So that second bank charter did not get renewed in 1836. And the next year, the Panic of 1837 happens. Now, history would just say, well, it's because they didn't have a bank anymore. And they never suggest that some kind of English retaliation or sabotage occurred to create the Panic of 1837. They blame it on Andrew Jackson's specie. So how was this significant to the 21st century? Well, I noticed during Trump's first administration that he had a portrait of Andrew Jackson in the Oval Office. Now, this was confusing, but I assumed significant because Andrew Jackson is considered the father or the founder of the Democrat Party. Donald Trump was in the Republican Party. He removed whatever portrait was previously there and put up the portrait of Andrew Jackson. This makes no sense for a Republican president to have the portrait of the Democrat founder in the background unless, and most likely, there's a significant reason for it. Now, during that same period of time, the Dems tried removing Andrew Jackson from the $20 bill, which coincidentally was the same year the Hamilton Broadway play was super popular. Now, Hamilton is on the $10 bill. He wasn't even a president. Yet they want to keep Hamilton. He wasn't even up for renewal, but Andrew Jackson was for renewal. And notice that most of us, we just think of Andrew Jackson as a crazy Indian killer. We never heard of the bank war, ever, ever, ever. The fact that we have never heard of the bank war, which was a 4-year war, is so colossally suspicious. Also, Andrew Jackson is the last president to pay off the national debt. He removed money from the federal banks and deposited them in the state banks. This was clearly an act of anti-federalism versus federalism. This old man, he was a conspiracy theorist. He once told me, hey, listen, kid, if you want to learn the real history, find old money and look at it. Old American money. The old money tells a completely different story of the history than the ones that you kids have been told. Find the old money and you'll find a whole new storyline. And so there was the Panic of 1837, the National Bank Act of 1863, the crime of 1873, which I think they demonetized silver. There's also, none of us really understand what February 21, 1871 was all about. And I don't think it was reported well of the actual outcome of the election of 1876. You would think this election would have a movie about it. There's not a single movie or reference that I know of that has the election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Tilden in it. But it was the closest election in history with some of the biggest consequences. The biggest consequence is that the Union Army was removed from the South and effectively ended Reconstruction. And that brings us to the final topic, the time period between 1880 and 1901. Now, a buddy of mine that I communicate with all the time on all these topics, he's my intellectual equivalent. He told me, and he never really fully explained it, but he said, hey, listen, between the years 1880 to 1901, if you could get your hands on any books, do it, because they're like all uncensored. Everything was out in the open, and some extreme evil was occurring during that time period. And I thought, it's weird. I don't know of any real events between that time period. It's like a blackout. And then I looked up the dates. I was like, when did James Garfield and William McKinley get assassinated? And James Garfield was assassinated in 1881, which falls in that 1880 to 1901 timeline. And William McKinley was assassinated in 1901. So between these two assassinations, this is a specific time period that there's something occurring here. I can't put my finger on it, but you would think that there'd be a lot of hoopla about James Garfield and William McKinley being assassinated. And I don't know anything about those. And they were briefly mentioned in a single sentence when I was in school. 2 assassinated presidents and no real narrative about it. We know nothing. So I'm just leaving you with that. That's curious. Highly, highly curious that we don't have an instant. Like we know Abraham Lincoln, he was killed by John Wilkes Booth after the Civil War. Like that, we understand. John F. Kennedy was killed by somebody, John F. Kennedy was killed by Lee Harvey Oswald. and we know their intentions and reasons. There are answers to Garfield and McKinley. I'm not going to even bother with those, but it's suspicious, especially with the assassin of one of them. Why are these omitted? We don't even, like most people don't even know these presidents were assassinated. Suspicious to me. And the blackout of really knowing much about 1880 to 1901 is equally suspicious. We know so much about the Civil War, but anything after the Civil War, all the way up to World War I beginning, we got a real blackout. That's a lot of time that was blacked out. Okay, for my final piece here, just in case you're a know-it-all and you think, hey, this guy doesn't, no, he's just stretching the truth. He's just looking for things that aren't there. I will leave you with this quote from Charles Thomson. Charles Thomson was the secretary of the Continental Congress during the American Revolution. He served the entire time through all of those one-year presidents that we talked about earlier. So the quote is, "I shall not undeceive future generations." It's a quote by Charles Thomson, the secretary of the Continental Congress during the American Revolution. Thompson began writing a history of the war, but later gave it up, explaining that he could not tell the truth without offending people. He said, "Let the world admire our patriots and heroes. Perhaps they may adopt the qualities that have been ascribed to them, and thus good may be done." Some say that Thompson's decision was a loss to future generations because of his knowledge of the politics of the Revolution. Others say that historians do a good job with the sources they have, and that it's a reminder that unless something is written down and preserved, it's often lost to history. And apparently he destroyed all of the records of the actual real history. So if you think you got it all figured out, if you don't got Charles Thomson's quote in there to let you know that whatever you think it is, he's not going to undeceive you of what you believe. And ask yourself, have you ever heard of Charles Thomson? This guy is one of the most significant founders. He was the secretary from 1773 to 1789. He was there for the entire thing. The only guy to hold office throughout the entire revolution and pre-revolution. And I've never heard of him until recently. I've never heard that quote in my life. So what's going on here? Don't you think that this quote and this guy should have been part of our history? And yet he wasn't. What's up with that? And what would have offended people had he told the truth about it? So I'll leave you with that. I hope this was extreme food for thought. Did it make you think? Did you make it this far in the video? Leave me a comment on your thoughts. Thanks for watching. See you next time.